Good morning. I'm Lori Matson, President and CEO of the Tri-City Regional Chamber. Thank you so much for attending the third annual Tri-Cities Diversity Summit. Much thought and planning have gone into this three-day summit, which features 5 listening sessions intended to create open, meaningful dialogue about issues that affect businesses and residents in our region. Today's first session will focus on racial equity and reconciliation. The next session, which begins at 11:15, focuses on citizen and law enforcement relations. Before we begin, allow me to thank Battelle, the premier sponsor of the Diversity Summit. We greatly appreciate their partnership during the past 3 years as premier sponsor of this impactful event. Next, I'd like to introduce Dolores Breske, President and CEO of Hapo Community Credit Union, gold sponsor, to say a few words.
I'm Dolores Breske, President and CEO for Hapo Community Credit Union. It's a great honor to support and be a part of today's Diversity Summit. At Hapo, we believe that leading by inclusion brings greater value to those we serve. We embrace differences and strive to listen to and meet the changing needs of the workforce, our membership, and our surrounding communities. We promote individuality and encourage our employees and our members to be themselves. By doing so, we believe it ignites a culture of productivity, collaboration, and innovation, thus powering our communities forward. We strive to create a positive impact for our members and the communities we serve through financial education, charitable contributions, as well as volunteerism. As we support our community, we go beyond financial impact and seek partnerships that support our core values. That said, this summit is important to our community for a number of reasons. Together, we can create an inclusive community where everyone feels welcomed, valued, and safe. It matters.
Thank you, Dolores, and thanks for that really important message. Let's welcome our first moderator, Kimberly Harper, and her panelists who will discuss creating, managing, and distributing resources in a way that gives people from all racial backgrounds the opportunity to thrive. Kimberly is a scientist and founder of eMERGE, a STEM-focused mentor program for middle and high school girls. She is also the co-chair for the MyTri 2030 Inclusion Council, whose members have helped to coordinate this event. Welcome, Kimberly.
Thank you, Lori, for that introduction. Well, good morning, everyone. We have a magnificent group of panelists with us this morning. Their breadth of expertise is nothing short of impressive, and you will get a chance to see that. It is my distinct honor to introduce you to all of them. First, joining us is Lynn Carlson. Lynn is the founder and CEO of Gemini Core LLC, which helps organizations become more effective by guiding them through change and organizational learning. Lynn is an organizational development practitioner, a certified diversity professional, as well as a certified business mentor at SCORE. She has over 23 years of corporate experience implementing inclusive leadership in the IT industry. She possesses great skills in strategy, intervention, and evaluation, and specializes in group dynamics, teaming skills, and strengths development.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Next, we have Mr. John Wood, Jr., who is a former nominee of Congress. John is the former vice chairman of the Republican Party of Los Angeles County. He is a noted writer and speaker on the subjects of political and racial reconciliation. He's written books, and some of his written work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Examiner, and Quillette magazine. He is a national spokesperson for the bipartisan organization Braver Angels, a national citizens movement devoted to the work of restoring civic trust in the U.S. Braver Angels is vested in healing the wounds of effective political polarization and restoring civic trust by helping Americans understand each other beyond stereotypes. In other words, building a house united. Next, we have Dr. Anna Plemons. Anna is the Assistant Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs at WSU Tri-Cities and a faculty member in the Digital Technology and Culture program. Her research focuses broadly on issues of educational justice. In higher education, that focus is applied to issues of access for underrepresented students. She has done extensive research on the impacts of the school to prison pipeline, focusing her research and teaching practice on decolonized pedagogies and rational methodologies. Her book, Beyond Progress in the Prison Classroom, Options and Opportunities, was released last year. And then finally, we have April Castaneda. April is the Chief Human Resources Officer with the Pacific Northwest Division of Battelle. Prior to coming to Battelle, April worked as the Assistant Director of HR for Caltech, where she conducted equity investigations and assessments. She possesses over 25 years of experience and renders expertise in all areas of HR, including a rich background in HR strategy and communications, organizational development, human relations, performance management, learning and development, presentation, and facilitation. So once again, I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us this morning and for rendering your voices. I'm looking forward to an excellent conversation. So as we get into this, I want to set the stage a little bit. We'll plan to spend about 5 minutes on each conversational theme. And I know that that's packing a lot into an hour. So as we talk, I want to make sure that we're pulling two threads. One is the illuminating idea of racial equity, what it means, its achievability, and how history informs our journey towards it. The second thread is the aspirational idea of racial reconciliation. We see glimpses of racial reconciliation all around us, even in the midst of chaos. And I think that no greater example of that exists in our young people. So I'd like to take our audience, I'd like our audience to acquire some key takeaways that will help us as individuals and community members continue this work towards racial equity and reconciliation. And that brings us to our first theme, the inadvertent conflation between racial equity and racial equality. When we think about building racial equity, oftentimes there is an inadvertent conflation between the two. April, in your work as an HR director, I'm guessing that you spend time covering these definitions quite often. Can you kick us off by speaking about the importance of understanding the difference between equity and equality?
Yes, thank you, Kim. This is one of those things that people try to use the words interchangeably, right? And they're really not. So when you think about equality, it's equal, which means the same. Equity is about creating equitable and fairness, right? So as a person who is watching the World Series and watching the Dodgers, I will use a little baseball example, right? Is that when you think about kids who are trying to watch a baseball game and there's a fence there, right? And they're all trying to look and see the game over the fence. Somebody who's 6 feet tall can see over the fence very easily. Somebody who's 5 feet tall may not be able to see over it. So we maybe give something for them to stand on so they can still have that equitable view, be able to see. And so there's things that we do as organizations that help create that equity so everybody can have the same access or same view. It's not assuming that everybody is equal and the same. Everybody doesn't get the same exact thing. What you're trying to do is really create a sense of fairness where people have same access to things. And you do things to make that happen. And that's really where, as you think about the importance of what we do in organizations, that we help people in the workplace in particular have those things so that they can have the same access.
Thank you. I think that that context is so important to have as we start this conversation. So, John, in your work, can you talk to us a little bit about how, as a community, we can better frame these discussions?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so there is this tension between the idea of equality on the one hand and equity on the other hand, because in part, the ideal of equality is deeply sort of stemmed in our history. And it's important as an ideal in the sense that we should all regard each other as having equal worth as human beings. In the context of society, our starting points, because of history and because of other circumstances, means that each of our own particular contexts have to be treated with respect to what is required for us to really have genuinely equitable, genuinely commensurate participation in the governing of our society, in the operating of our institutions. I think one of the most important things we need to do to sort of invite everybody to this conversation in a positive way is to understand that there's an asset-based mentality that can be taken to it. In other words, developing equitable structures for inclusion does not have to suggest that we are taking things away from one group, giving it to another in a way that is unfair. Rather, we at a communal level are getting to know each other in a way to where we can, in being sensitive to each other's individual needs, can lift up the commonwealth of the whole in a way that benefits everybody, because we're getting the most value out of the diversity of our experiences, our cultural perspectives, and our expertise. So reframing the equitable framework in a way to where it's clear that it is a positive for everybody and not something that needs to be zero sum at the expense of one group or the other is, I think, a starting point for having this conversation in a way that works for all communities.
I love it. Any additional thoughts from our other panelists?
I'll jump in. I really appreciate how our panelists have really defined these terms clearly, and that's very helpful to me and to this conversation. Just for one more analogy for fun, I think sometimes folks might be new to thinking about what equity means as we talk about reconciliation and racially invested conversations. But I think this is already a value that we have and one that we operate on regularly. So if I think about, for instance, let's say I have 3 kids, one's going to college on the East Coast, 2 live at home, Thanksgiving's coming up, I'm buying a plane ticket for the kid who's on the East Coast, and I'm not going to turn around and hand $350 to my other kids, because what I want is I want everyone at the table, right? And that's what I want. And so my job to make that equitable is to figure out, what each person needs to get there. And in case, that analogy might be a little paternalistic. We want to be careful about being paternalistic in these conversations, but the same is true in workplaces, right? If you think about travel reimbursement, you get reimbursed for how far you traveled. So again, this idea of how do we get everybody at the table for the conversations that lead our community forward, and just remember that even if this idea of equity feels new to us in this context, it's a value that we already have and one that we operate by in our business lives.
Absolutely.
So what I would add is I love the analogy about shoes. So equality, everybody gets the size 12 shoe, but that doesn't help me because I wear size 5. So equity is me getting the size 5 shoe. But I think about another perspective as we approach equity is a bit of a holistic approach and a comprehensive approach, as we remember that there are different kinds of equity, right? So today we're talking about racial equity. Tomorrow we may be talking about gender equity. Later on in the summit, we're going to be talking about economic equity. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring intersectionality into this discussion today because I know it was going to come up at some point. So we just really have to think from a systems approach and a holistic approach, how all of these different forms of inequity in our society today intersect.
Great. So we've set the stage. I think that was a wonderful context to have. The next thing we want to kind of move into is this thing about taboo, right? One of my favorite quotes by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is, "We may have all come on different ships, but we're in the same boat now." I think that as we are probably all keenly aware, our need to better understand one another is palpable. And it's going to take that for us to achieve this pinnacle of unitedness, right? But the subject of race has long been one of taboo. People just really don't like talking about it outside of their homogenous groups. A long-established American history of inequality, deep-rooted shame, generational anger, embedded fear, all serve as roadblocks and make these conversations super difficult to have. So now I want to get into your thoughts about the importance of having these difficult conversations and pick your brains about some of the know-how. John, in your work, what would you say are key ground rules for having effective conversations about race? And maybe you can touch on how best to get people who may have polar opposite viewpoints to even come to the table?
Right. So the answers to this question are going to vary a little bit depending on the context. So I'll try and lay out just a couple of general principles here. On the one hand, there has to be something of a recognition for the need for these conversations to take place. Not everybody is equally sort of committed to the idea that there's even really a conversation to be had. There can be a certain sort of complacency around racial dialogue. And so raising awareness of the larger sorts of inequities that we face in society on the macro level and how they can manifest themselves in the healthy functioning of institutions can be important. If you're already in an institutional context, of course, you may realize that, okay, I need to go to this session or I need to engage in this conversation because, you know, my job requires it, but you want people to genuinely be committed to the dialogue, right? You don't want people just showing up because they're being made to do so. So when it comes to the actual point of the conversation itself, establishing a dynamic to where we can show that there is a non-contradiction between empathy and equity, that when we show up to a conversation about race, it is not going to be a conversation that is going to, on the one hand, be act in an oppressive manner towards people who are going to be having a certain suffering in that background that needs to be acknowledged, right? Not glossing over the implications of the differences in terms of where we're coming from, in terms of status and privilege, et cetera. But on the other hand, holding the conversation in a way to where it is clear that everybody's voice matters in the conversation, everybody's story has an opportunity to be expressed, able to honor the perspectives of all people while still getting at the truth of what it is that needs to take place in order for us to more greatly function together as a community, even in an institutional context. Setting the stage for the empathetic sharing of stories and conversations that have the heart to take in difficult social dynamics, but the space to allow for all perspectives or for all different experiences. That's something that has to be established if people are going to be comfortable coming to the table from across a wide circumference of different starting points.
I love that concept of sharing stories. I always like to say that the most difficult conversations become easier to have when people speak from their own experiences and they really share their human experience, right? It's easy for a person to get angry with you or to become defensive when you're talking about subjects that are controversial if there is no connection to humanity. And so given kind of that perspective, Anna, can you talk a little bit about the importance of humanizing, right, the subject of racial equity to be able to work towards reconciliation?
Sure. Yeah, I hope so. I think when I think about these kinds of conversations as somebody who identifies as white, I think I have particular responsibilities, and these are the responsibilities that I've laid out for myself, and I'll share them. And if they land, cool. But I think listening is important, right? People say like, I don't know what to say. You're like, try not saying anything, right? So I think listening is really important. I think to your point about story, believing people when they tell you their story is really important. It's so painful and so dehumanizing. I think we all have had the experience, maybe not in this context, of sharing a story, sharing a piece of our heart, and having somebody dismiss it, and that's so painful and so dehumanizing, right? So part of humanizing these kinds of conversations is just believing people when they tell you their story, and I think that's my responsibility when I come to these conversations. And then I also think it's my responsibility to suspend kind of the impulse to be defensive, and to suspend the impulse to try to quickly fix something that is indeed complex. So those are, I think, are my responsibilities in trying to come to these conversations as a human and to really be respectful and try to do work that's humanizing for whoever it is that I'm speaking to or with or listening to.
Right.
Yeah, and can I just jump in there, Kim? I think that there's some things that you said that are really important in there, Anna, around the idea of you don't have to fix it. That listening is an action, because as a person who's worked with scientists most of my career, there's a big, push to, we want to just fix it. We want to get to the answer. And I'm like, no, listening is an action. And we also know that connection actually builds teams. So if you don't, we're really good, especially in the US, of compartmentalizing and saying, okay, I go to work, I'm just gonna get this work done, I'm gonna leave my personal at the door. We now know that doesn't work. There's lots of research on this around how important human connection is, which means you have to have the ability to listen, even if you don't understand, but that you're showing and demonstrating that you want to hear. And, I always kind of joke with my husband because, we've been married a long time. And in the beginning, it was like every time I'd bring something up, he wanted to fix it. And we had to do a little training, right, on, okay, this is a listen moment. So now he goes, is it a listen moment or a fix it moment? And that's part of our understanding as we get more sophisticated in talking about race, because there's a lot of pain associated. And there's a lot of ways that we try to just compartmentalize it. We're not going to bring it into this space because we can't deal with the pain. And it's okay. Like, I think just opening up the ability for people to listen and just show that they're being seen and heard will increase those connections, and then we'll get better.
Perfect. And then, Lynn, can you talk a little bit about the intersectionality of using storytelling to build equity and reconciliation?
Yeah, I feel like stories and conversations and dialogue are how we connect, right? And reconciliation is all about relationships and connecting and being in community with each other. And so when it comes to these conversations, I love providing resources for organizations who are going to dive into these conversations. What we've all been talking about, Glenn Singleton calls community agreements, right? So AKA ground rules, that we go into these conversations, that there's no fixing, and that we make space for multiple truths, right? The word "and" is so powerful when we have such a binary, linear society in the United States, right? We're very us and them, we're very either or. So I find that and especially the work of John Schwartz, who is a facilitator, if we focus on interests rather than positions, right? And we see this today in some of the political polarization that's going on. We all have common interests, right? We all want health and well-being. But when we start to dig in on that polarization based on focusing on our positions, that's when these conversations around reconciliation can really break down. And at the end of the day, the reason for these community agreements is to create the sense of psychological safety that has to happen in these conversations. The primary reason people do not engage in conversations around race is fear. Just like Anna said, fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of offending someone. And so these kinds of community agreements help create the psychological safety that helps us begin to build the racial stamina to have these conversations.
Excellent. So we've established there's a distinct difference between equity and equality, and understanding the difference is super important to even being able to sit down and have, a conversation about how to build equity and reconciliation. Then we've talked about the importance of storytelling, humanizing one another, finding commonality, a community agreement, right? So that we're able to sit down at the same table and express our authenticity, our own experiences, right? Next, I want to kind of get into the value of historical context to charting a healthy path forward. So, Anna, in your work, how important is historical knowledge to the advancement of racial equity? How do previous advancements like the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil Rights Movement, voting rights, Reconstruction Board, Brown versus Board of Education, anti-redlining legislation, equal pay for equal work, how do some of those things inform our way forward?
Yeah, thanks. I'm a product of the public school, and I had so many teachers throughout my education who were just flat out fantastic and committed to their work, and really, beautiful souls, staying up late, grading papers, working hard. And there was a lot I didn't learn at school, right? And so this idea of understanding U.S. history and understanding U.S. history, probably not as it was taught to us, right? Like that's going to be something I'm going to have to do for myself in adulthood. And something that I continue to try to do for myself is really become a student of a more complete history of, the globe, but really in particular this nation. And so I think like this year, for instance, I picked up Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, and I thought I understood about the Great Migration, and I flat out didn't. And that one just really like broke my heart open in a way that I just didn't understand that. And it's important for me to keep looking for places to better understand history just as a citizen, so that then I can understand when I see things on the news or I hear people say things, I can kind of get past some of that initial reaction of, well, why are they mad? Why are they this? Why are they that? It's like there's a bunch of history that I likely wasn't going to learn unless I went out and learned it. And then so it's my privilege as an educator to get to design courses where that hopefully remedy some of that. And I know from, again, a lot of the students that come to my class, they say, I had no idea, we've never talked about this. This didn't come up in my family. This didn't come up in my school. And that's not to be critical of parents or educators, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand how we got here so that we can move forward to where it is we really want to go.
So in your work, doing research on the school to prison pipeline, just as an example, have you looked at, or do you have any insight on how, as a student, being exposed to a broader history of maybe where they come from has an impact on their performance in school, number one, but then the impact on the journey that they take moving forward in terms of preventative measures?
Yeah, I mean, there's scholars who could speak to this so much more eloquently than I can, because really most of my experience has been teaching in the prison and thinking about how we can sort of think of incarcerated students in new and different ways to help them be assets to their own communities. And so I don't want to overstep the bounds of what I know, but I do know when I think about school to prison pipeline, I know we need to think really critically and carefully and in exciting ways about what we're teaching our children as far as like what it's helping them understand about themselves and having full and rich and positive identities. But we also, I think when I think about school to prison pipeline, I think a lot about the disproportionate punishment of students of color and that those things happen early and often, and that there's an accumulative effect. And so I think those are the two conversations I think about school to prison pipeline curriculum, but also the way that policing kind of happens in schools under the radar, on the radar, all the different ways. So
I like to say you can't legislate morality, right? You can't force someone to see your true, authentic self. We all look at people through the lens of whatever our experiences are. But Lynn, in your work with young people, what would you say are some of the key factors that we as adults, as parents and educators and community members should really take in and use as key factors? What should we be paying attention to in order to reset perceptions and attitudes?
I think there are now a ton of resources for talking to your children about race, from preschool to middle school to high school. This concept of race being a taboo conversation starts when we're young and starts when we're at home, when our parents, we're walking through the grocery store and we ask, oh, well, why is that person's skin so dark or something like that? And mom goes, shh, be quiet. Don't say anything. You don't say that stuff. Right. So I think, parents at home and especially in the schools, there's a lot of great books and a lot of great resources to begin to have these conversations. Anna touched on something really important as well, is the affirmation that goes on in the classroom and the understanding of identities and how we show up in spaces. And, in the classroom, we begin to talk about things like internalized oppression. We get to talk about things like stereotype threat. And also we start to talk about things in terms of, not only racial ethnic identity development, but positive white identity development, to show how in the history of social justice work, white allyship and white solidarity also has a place in this movement. So I think as students come into those conversations in the classroom, they get to see sort of the liberation, the asset-based approach to moving us forward in a positive direction for positive change.
Beautiful. Anyone else want to jump in with thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would make the general observation that a familiarity with history and the complexities of history on a broader scale is what prepares us to begin to have empathy for the particular stories of the individuals and groups of individuals with whom we share community and with whom we may share an institutional relationship. And so obviously it's important to make a little bit of a distinction between the broader history of any group of people within the United States and the particular experience of somebody sitting across the table from you. One does not substitute for the other. And we are at risk sometimes of making assumptions about individuals on the basis of things we read in textbooks that sometimes are a little bit off the mark if they preset us too much in our one-to-one dialogue. For instance, I'm African-American. My wife is African-American. I'm biracial. She is not. I grew up in the suburbs. She grew up in the projects. Our Black experiences are substantially different. And so you wouldn't want to just take a broad narrative of Black America and use that to make assumptions about our own, me and my wife's own particular existences, in this society. Nevertheless, having larger context can prepare us to understand how different individuals within a certain context may show up in a situation. So it sets the stage for an understanding that can become more particularized as we engage on the levels of person-to-person interactions.
Good point. We are not a monolith, I want to tell people.
Right.
Our experiences are different as a culture. So when we're talking about the younger generation, I like to say that they inspire me, but they also scare me. Sometimes I don't know whether to, throw my hands up and cheer or pull the covers, up over my head. This idea of bending the long arc of the moral universe toward justice, they don't see that arc is very long. So how would you say that generational attitudes play into solution finding? I find that this generation is, the instant gratification generation. They're the solution finding generation. And so a lot of the things that have been put into place that we call rules or, decorum's probably not the right word, but our way of doing things. Some of those things they see as obstacles, and in some instances they're actually right. They believe in cutting through the red tape and just getting to the answer right now. How do you think those attitudes play in this conversation around building equity and reconciliation? And I'll start with April on that question.
Thank you. Yeah, Kim, you're killing me. I love it because as you think about the young generation, it's the same thing our parents said about us, right? Every new generation that comes up, we say, oh my gosh, they're at a loss. But what we find is, especially when you look at that historical context, it's often the younger generation that moves things forward because they aren't bound to the rules. So for me, I have great hope as I see the next generations coming into the workplace, how they think about things and do things. We know that the millennials and moving into Gen Z are going to be the most racially diverse. They're going to have the most diversity of any generation that we've had. They have been exposed to it more than any generation before, which to me makes them uniquely qualified to be able to help us build inclusive experiences. And there's more from the point of view that we have to think about how do we, as those other generations, listen. Yes, there is some guidance, but that's just also part of just growing up. And as you get more experience in life, those things change. But I'm okay with them not following all the rules because we don't want them to. We're not going to be able to move towards justice if we keep following the same rules, because what got us here won't get us there. right? And as we talk about all the things that aren't working, it's because we've been doing them a certain way. So you got to try it differently. So I really think our hope for thinking about reconciliation, for talking, to even be comfortable with having these conversations, to erasing taboo, that is going to be our younger generation is who's going to help us get there.
Great. Would you like to add something to that, Lynn? I know you do a lot of work with young people as well.
Yeah, I'm just really inspired how so many movements, over sort of the long arc of time and even currently nationally are led by young people, right? And, my work, especially in the school districts, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th graders, like they're social justice advocates. They are warriors. They are ready to speak. They are ready to take action. They're ready to go to the streets, to get involved. And a lot of it stems from how over time the concept of the American dream and the concept of success and well-being shifts, right? I mean, we see so many youth shifting away from materialism and capitalism. We see them shifting from the individualist mindset to the collectivist mindset. And so I really do feel like every progressive generation gets more flexible. And I think for, kind of like what April was saying, for the 5 generations that are in the workplace right now, I think the concept of neuroplasticity comes to mind. We have to be so cognitively flexible across the generations. And typically, the more we age, the more rigid our thoughts become. And the youth have such flexible, creative, innovative thoughts. And so I really feel like when it comes to capturing the potential of the youth in, helping positive change move forward in our society, I think that flexibility and really capitalizing on their potential is where it's at.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. We have a question that popped up in the chat that I'd like to ask, and maybe John, you can take this question. This question says that when it comes to so much of our nation's history being left out for so many of us, how do we look to positively impact our school's curriculum so that history is taught from a more equitable perspective?
Well, so I'm not an educator by trade, although I have worked in and around education in different capacities. So I'll take a swing at that. I mean, I think that taking a more sort of comprehensive look at what the relevant chapters and streams of American history are, and how we design our curriculums is just sort of the fundamental thing that needs to take place here. Anna was talking about how in adulthood she's come to realize all of these important chapters of American history that shed light upon, the inequities of our present across racial categories, or things that were simply not communicated to her within her curriculum. And that's just a testament to the fact that, so much of American history has not been seen as particularly relevant to our understanding of this country in mainstream education. Now, I tend to be a person who believes that does not mean that we need to de-emphasize the importance of some traditional themes in American education. It means that we need to sort of expand our understanding of what is relevant, important, and definitive in much of our history, right? So we need to broaden our sense of what matters. And if I could just tie this to one little thing, I do think that part of what we want to capture in our history are the experiences that produce generational wisdom that is handed down over time. And I do think that young people traditionally have tended to spur urgency in social change. And in a way, I think that is sort of the elemental role of youth. But I do think that we need to bridge the divide between generations too. And part of that means honoring age. Part of that means honoring our elders. And the fact that while it is true that, older people may become more complacent with the status quo, our elders also have something to teach us in terms of how it is change is accomplished over time, how it is we endure adversity while maintaining our empathy with people who are different from us, because We need the space to remember that even as we are opposing each other socially, we're trying to build the beloved community together, ultimately. And that's the end state. And so when you take that human-centered approach to understanding history and social progress, it requires you to be a little bit more patient, because it's not just about passing laws, it's about affecting the hearts of people. And so seeing how that drama plays itself out over history is something that our curriculums could do a better job of exploring with us. And it's something that our elders, as living representatives of history, in many cases, even of relatively recent history, have the lived experience to be able to call forth for us as well.
I like what you said about capturing the hearts of people. I believe that, whether it's in an employee to employer environment, an organizational environment, sports team, each individual needs to be able to see themselves right in the bigger picture, in the vision, and to be able to embrace that vision to move it forward. So maybe Anna, from an educator standpoint, you can address that question as well. I know that one of the things that I learned in recent years is that Katherine Johnson, a scientist who is a native of Richland, Washington, was instrumental in being able to put a man on the moon. And I did, study science. I studied chemistry actually and became a scientist via education. But who knows where I would have gone if I heard a story like that, as a kid coming up. How inspirational is it to be able to look in, the grander context of curriculum in school, as you're coming up as a kid, and be able to see yourself in this American narrative. So I appreciate this young man's question. So can you maybe talk to that from the perspective of an educator?
Sure. I think to the points that were earlier made, we absolutely need to think about the curriculum, look at the curriculum. So, push our school boards, push the people who are creating curriculum to expand it so that it is more life-giving, if I can use that term, life-giving for all of our students. But I also think more immediately, this is a yes and. We need to do that. We need to think about this at a system level. And I right now know a lot of teachers in the Tri-Cities who are flat out ready to do this work. And I think they're a little wary, right? And so, right now I have students in high school and middle school, and my daughter who's in high school, she read Stamped, and somehow her English teacher found out she read Stamped, and she's like, "You read Stamped? Can we talk about that? Can you come to office hours?" I'm trying to decide if I can assign that book. And so I know that there's so much goodwill and so much energy among the teaching faculty here in the Tri-Cities. And same thing, I'm kind of listening in, since school's at home, to what's happening in the middle school classrooms. And there's a lot of really great work that's happening. And so I think when we find out about that, we have to support those teachers, right? Because they're gonna get noise, they're gonna get static. So how am I making sure that when a teacher kind of decides to do something in their curriculum that is life-giving and that is expansive, make sure they know I have their back every single time, and that other parents do as well. Other simple things too. I know, like, when I ever would go to the book fair at the elementary school, right, and teachers have lists of books they want, I only have $10 in my pocket. I'm only going to buy books that have brown or black protagonists, right? I know the teachers are going to ask for them. The question is, how am I going to spend my $10 when I go to the book fair as a parent? And so I think we need to think about this structurally, but then also there's a lot we can do today to support our teachers who are trying to do this work and make sure that they're not kind of exposed or extended without the support to do the work that they really want to do.
Yeah, I have a story about when my daughter was a preschooler. I picked her up from her preschool and she got in the car saying, "Mommy, I want to be pink." And I thought, what are you talking about? And it dawned on me that she was the only, Black child in her preschool. And so we had a conversation, when we got home, about the beauty of color. And so, I didn't make a big deal out of it with her, but the next morning, when I took her back to preschool, I asked her teacher, how many of your learning materials have children of color in them? Because this happened, yesterday when I picked her up. And the teacher had no animosity, it was totally unintentional, but it's just something she hadn't thought about before. And so telling her that story prompted her to go get, additional learning materials with children of color in them. And just that small act, by an educator, recognizing that the children that you're touching and, interfacing with on a daily basis want to be seen. Everybody wants to be seen, wants to be loved, right? So yeah, I totally agree with you. What would you say, and this is to all of the panelists, are some of the greatest threats and obstacles to our progress as a community, as a nation, as a world, when it comes to the subject of race?
Well, yeah, there are so many answers to that question, and obviously you can look at certain structural or political trends and identify them as being salient. I prefer to, for me, what I want to contribute here is just a subtler observation, but something I think is core, which is to understand that the work of advancing social justice, if it's going to work in an enduring fashion over time, must also be the work of building community. And that requires a certain sort of orientation in terms of how we engage this work that manages to walk that line and really stand firm in the tension that exists between speaking truth to power and advocating for what you believe on the one hand, and honoring the human dignity in all people on the other hand, even when other people are in error or happen to be ignorant of something or are coming from a place of malice themselves. Because we are all products of a history and a set of circumstances that has so much to do with why it is that we are the way we are. So this is why Dr. King said that the end of nonviolence is not, in his context, the end of nonviolence is not to humiliate or defeat the white man, not to humiliate or defeat the opponent. And he said it both ways in different contexts, but rather to win his understanding and his friendship, because together we build the beloved community. And the principle of nonviolence is that even in speaking truth and advancing justice for those who are marginalized, you seek to do that for those who are on the other side of the social question as well. Because when we cut people out of the human family, even if we do it from a position of saying, well, we're fighting for what's just, we're fighting for progress, if we are cutting empathy within ourselves, we create enmity in society. And so even if that allows us to integrate a particular school or institution or advance reforms in the short term, that snaps back over time unless we create the space for genuine understanding and reconciliation to take place. And so that's also why I stress the wisdom of our elders and so forth, because I think that there are moral traditions that inform social justice that don't present themselves as being expedient in the sort of materialist, social media, instant gratification culture of the moment, that we do want to reclaim in the heart and spirit of what we do. And if we don't do that, I'm concerned about the prospects for change that is positive, that lasts.
Good points. Anybody else want to chime in?
Yes, so I would just add, and of course I'm coming from that human resource perspective, that one of the biggest roadblocks I see, especially in workplaces, is that we're often focused on the numbers and not the experience. So what we'll say is, okay, we need to recruit more and more, and I keep saying, when you invite people to your house, you clean up your house first. So as we think about those roadblocks of how are we creating places where people feel like they belong, where we create connection for everybody. And if you haven't embraced those concepts of bringing people into a team, into a workplace, into a group, into a community, and that you really understand what belonging, connection, and meaning means for people, and that you have that sense of being able to build empathy, we will not be able to move this forward.
Mm-hmm. Yep, excellent point. So when we think about the reconciliation thread, and we got another question from our audience that I think may tie into this. When we're thinking about moving beyond the status quo, how we're doing things now, and speaking to the things that aren't effective, right? Stereotypes, and then how we are or are not seeing ourselves in one another. One of the questions that came in asks, how do we fix the fact that people of color are treated differently than their white counterparts when it comes to punishment, from schools to the courts? How do you begin to have those conversations? You know, the conversation of race is broader, but this is kind of, you know, more of a nuanced view into that broader discussion of race. So can one of you address that? And maybe Anna, you want to start, and then maybe Lynn.
Yeah, I just want to validate that it needs to be addressed, right? That is absolutely, there is fundamentally some issues that are structurally in the justice system, and they need to be addressed, because until they are, right, it's as an educator who works in the prison, I'm so profoundly aware that the work that I'm doing is too little too late, right? That what we really need is to stem the tide of people going into prison and really look at those issues. But those are also, that's big, right? And that feels hard, and it's going to require us to like educate ourselves and figure out how we can engage those issues, how we can demand those things of our legislators and move them forward. But it absolutely has to be done. And it's still my honor and my privilege to teach in prison and think about asset-based ways to think about, you know, working with incarcerated people and helping them reintegrate into their communities. But that conversation is by no means a substitute for the one that we really need to look very closely at that's on the front end.
And then Lynn?
Yeah, I think for folks who are starting down their anti-racism journey, they begin to understand the impact of systems, right? And institutionalized racism and structures and systems. And so, you know, we have to look at change also from that level. As an organizational practitioner, I am very much an advocate of participative change, because you can't force change. You know, as soon as you start forcing things, nobody likes to be told what to do. People just start digging and resisting. And so, you know, it starts a little bit with that inner work of understanding our own unconscious biases and how we treat people, and understanding how stereotypes come into play for how we treat people differently. But also it's the interventions that have to happen at the individual level, the group level, the organizational level, that promote that change. And, you know, to the earlier question about threats and obstacles to progress, I think a lot of organizations just don't know where to start, right? They just sort of have analysis paralysis. I don't know what to do. And then two things about white dominant culture that get in the way are perfectionism and expertise. We feel like we have to know everything and we have to be doing it perfectly before we ever engage, before we ever get started. And so I think if we can understand that starting small and building on the root cause of success, in addition to not only treating symptoms, but treating the root causes of some of these inequities and mistreatments that happen in our organizations, I think that lens will help move us forward and start thinking about things like restorative justice and trauma-informed practices, and being able to think about how these practices can become real life in our communities. So I really think that when it comes to that differential treatment in the social justice systems, you know, putting that into policy, but also individual folks that are in that space doing that inner work.
And I may have cut you off, John. I think you may have been getting ready to address that one.
Yeah, I mean, well, you know, I just wanted to observe that there you know, probably a couple of distinctions to be made, because on the one hand, there's the phenomenon of disparities as a consequence of policy and the sort of, you know, the operation of our institutions. And so, you know, I mean, if you have a system of law which requires mandatory minimums for, you know, different sorts of substance usage or trafficking that are, you know, the substances may be essentially equivalent, but for various reasons, one is punished at a much higher rate than the other. That's something that can effectively be solved through political reform. That can be solved through changing the law. If you have differences in outcomes that are a consequence of some subtle bias operating within the folks who are in positions of authority to make decisions, and they just happen to be acting in such a way to where they're more sensitive to guilt in one party than another, correlating to identity, correlating to race, then that has to be approached from a different angle. And that gets back to creating the context for a genuine sort of empathy to take place in our understanding. But even that has to walk in tension with the fact that decisions made in real time within institutions need to be engaged in a way to where, this is delicate. If there's a personnel sort of situation where the bias at play in a certain person in a position of authority is leading to negative outcomes, you want to be able to work with somebody to increase their scope of empathy while also limiting the damage that might be done in the moment. But we don't want to be so aggressive in seeking to rectify those situations that we don't take the time to listen to everybody in their relative position to understand what's accounting for each person's starting point. The reason I'm being so complex about this is because, frankly, it is complex. And I want us to recognize the fact that while the gross phenomenon of disparity is a reality in our culture, the mechanisms for engaging it have to be engaged on a situation by situation basis, even while certain broad principles are at play. So maybe we can have another hour sometime to get a little deeper.
You would throw that one in at the last minute. There's so much there that we could get into. But we are at the end of our time. Our next panel discussion is getting ready to start up, and hopefully someone will pick that up in one of the upcoming panels, because I think that's a very important discussion to have. Teasing out, motives and right versus wrong versus reasoning and motive.
Right.
I really appreciate all of you for taking time this morning with us. I hope that the audience, more importantly, has some great takeaways in terms of talking about racial equity and reconciliation. And remember that there is a very distinct difference between equity and equality. So if you don't take anything else away from this discussion, I'll go back to that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. quote that we may have all come on different ships, but we are actually in the same boat now. I added a couple of words, but I want us to leave this discussion with that notion that we're all in this together. And I want to encourage everyone, if you're of age and able to, please vote. It's very important. That's your one way to make sure that your voice is heard.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, Lynn, John, and Anna, for kicking off the summit with that fantastic discussion and sharing your experiences and your expertise. The Tri-City Regional Chamber values diversity, and we view it as a strength in our society. As a champion for the business community, we believe that creating an inclusive environment is key to the growth and sustainability of the Tri-Cities. So if you're joining us for the next session, which begins at 11:15, you can participate by using the same Zoom link. In this listening session, panelists will discuss law enforcement agencies and their duty to serve and protect all citizens based on principles of trust, mutual respect, transparency, cultural competence, and justice. And as a reminder, all sessions from the Diversity Summit will be posted on the Chamber's YouTube channel and at tricityregionalchamber.com. Thank you.